The sky above New Haven burned with colors that should not exist in nature, and Commander Rebecca Stone watched from the defense tower as her world died around her. And the alarms screamed through every speaker in the colony, but she already knew. It was too late because the first wave of alien ships had torn through their orbital platforms like they were made of paper. She turned to look at the woman standing beside her, and Vera was not human, though she looked almost like one with pointed ears and eyes that glowed faint silver in the darkness, and the elf woman stared up at the burning sky with an expression Rebecca had never seen before, because Vera was always calm and always knew what to do. But now she looked afraid. The dragon appeared from nowhere, and Ashkor was massive, with scales that shifted between blue and purple and green, depending on how the light hit them in his wings. Spread wide enough to cover the entire tower, and he made a sound that was not quite a roar, but more like a song that made Rebecca's chest vibrate. Vera reached up and touched the dragon's snout and spoke in a language Rebecca did not understand, and Ashkor responded with another sound, and then Vera turned to Rebecca with those glowing silver eyes and said that the Calrith had come and that they were searching for something ancient and dangerous. Rebecca wanted to ask what the Calrith were and why they attacked without warning, but another explosion rocked the tower, and she grabbed the railing to keep from falling, and when she looked down at the colony below, she saw buildings collapsing and fires spreading through the streets and people running in every direction trying to find shelter that did not exist. The communication system crackled to life, and a voice reported that the evacuation ships were under attack, and that only 3 had made it off the ground before the rest were destroyed. And Rebecca felt something break inside her chest. Because those ships carried children and families and people who trusted her to keep them safe. Vera moved to the edge of the tower and called out too. Ashkor, and the dragon lowered his head, and she climbed onto his neck without fear, and then she looked back at Rebecca and held out her hand and told her to come because there was no time left. Rebecca grabbed her hand, and Vera pulled her up onto Ashkor's back, and the scales were warm under her hands and smoother than she expected. And then the dragon leaped from the tower, and his wings caught the air, and they were flying through smoke and fire and debris below them. The colony was dying, and Rebecca saw Calrith soldiers moving through the streets, and they were tall and covered in black armor that seemed to absorb light, and they moved with perfect coordination, like parts of a machine, and wherever they went, people fell and did not get back up. The cord banked hard to avoid a burst of energy fire, and Rebecca held on tight, and Vera shouted something over the wind and pointed toward the old ruins on the edge of the colony, and Rebecca remembered that Vera had appeared from those ruins 3 years ago. When she stepped through a portal that no one understood, they landed hard in the ruins, and Rebecca stumbled off Ashkor's back, and her legs shook from fear and adrenaline, and Vira was already moving toward a stone archway that was covered in symbols that glowed with the same silver light as her ice. Vira placed her hands on the archway and spoke words in that ancient language, and the air inside the arch began to shimmer like heat waves, and then it turned into a window that showed somewhere else. And Rebecca could see a forest of silver trees under a purple sky, and she knew that place was not anywhere near New Haven. But before they could step through the portal, Rebecca remembered her duty, and she pulled out her communication device and activated the emergency beacon, and she spoke quickly. It said that New Haven was lost, and that the Calrith Dominion had attacked without warning, and that they needed help. And then she said that there was something more and something ancient that the aliens were searching. 4th beacon launched into the sky on a pillar of fire, and it would travel through the quantum relay network back to Earth, and Rebecca hoped that someone would receive the message and understand what it meant. Vera grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the portal and said they had to go now because the Calrith had found them, and Rebecca looked back and saw black-armored soldiers running through the ruins toward them, and Ashkor roared and flames erupted from his mouth and turned 3 soldiers into ash. They dove through the portal, and Rebecca felt like she was being pulled apart and put back together at the same time, and then they were falling onto soft grass under that purple sky, and she rolled onto her back and gasped for air, and her whole body hurt. VR knelt beside her and helped her sit up and asked if she was injured, and Rebecca shook her head and looked around at this impossible place and asked where they were, and Vera said they were in a place between places, and that time moved differently. Hiroshkor landed beside Them enfolded his wings, and his eyes glowed the same silver as Vera's, and the dragon made a low rumbling sound, and Vera nodded like she understood, and then she looked at Rebecca with an expression of deep sadness. She told Rebecca that her people were called the Sentinels, and that they had guarded the boundaries between worlds for thousands of years, and that they fought a war against the Sesqui long before humans ever left their home planet, and that war had nearly destroyed everything. Calrith were not born but made, and they were created by an ancient race to be servants and soldiers, but they evolved beyond their programming and turned against their creators and consumed them. And then they began spreading across the galaxy. Consuming everything in their path, the Sentinels fought them for centuries, and the war burned entire star systems and killed billions, and in the end the Sentinels won, but barely, and they sealed the Calrith away using a network of portals and barriers that stretched across dimensions. But Vera said that the seals were weakening, and Dewhaven had been built on top of one of the ancient seal points, and that Calrith had sensed it and attacked because they wanted to break through and find the weapons. And knowledge that the Sentinels had hidden away, Rebecca asked why Vera had not warned them, and why she had let people build a colony there, and Vera's eyes filled with tears, and she said she had not known because she had been asleep for 10,000 years, and when she woke 3 years ago, the colony was already there, and she had stayed to watch over the seal and hope it would hold. She said that she was the last of her people, and that Ashkor was the last of the dragons that had fought beside the Sentinels, and together they had survived when everyone else had fallen, and now they were all that stood between the Calrith and the rest of the galaxy. Rebecca stood up and looked back at the portal, and even from here she could see the glow of fires through the shimmering surface, and she thought about all the people she had failed to save and all the families that were gone, and the anger built in her chest until she could barely breathe. She told Vera that they had to go back to Earth and warn them and help them prepare, because humanity would not stand aside and let the Calrith destroy their colonies and kill their people. And Era looked at her with something like hope and said that this was what she had been waiting for. Sentinels had fought alone because the other species of their time were too afraid or too weak, but humans were different, and Vera had watched them for 3 years and seen their courage and determination, and she believed that together they might have a chance. Ashkor spread his wings and made that song sound again, and Vera smiled for the first time since the attack began, and she said the dragon agreed, and that he had grown fond of humans and their strange ways, and that he would fight beside them. Rebecca looked at the elf woman and her dragon and knew that everything had changed, and that the war that was coming would be like nothing humanity had ever faced before, but she also knew that they would not face it. Alan Avira opened another portal, and this one showed the starfield near Earth, and she said it would take them directly to the military command station, and that they had to move quickly because the Calrith would not wait. They stepped through together, and Rebecca carried with her the memory of New Haven burning, and the sound of her people screaming, and the knowledge that somewhere out there the aliens who had done this were still hunting, and she made a silent promise that humanity would make them pay for every life they had taken. The emergency beacon from New Haven traveled through space faster than light using quantum relay stations that bent the rules of physics, and when it reached Earth Command, the message played on every screen in the central operations room, and Admiral Kate Morrison listened to Rebecca Stone's voice speaking about fire and death and aliens called the Calrith. Room went silent when the message ended, and Kate looked at the faces of her officers and saw fear there, but also anger, and she knew that anger would be useful in the days to come, because humanity had just learned they were not alone in the universe, and their first contact was an attack that killed thousands. She called an emergency meeting with the unified government, and within hours representatives from every nation on Earth gathered in the council chamber, and they watched the recording again and debated what it meant and whether they should respond with force or try to negotiate. Some wanted to send diplomats, and others wanted to fortify their remaining colonies and wait, but Kate stood before them and said that waiting was not an option because the Calrith had proven they did not want peace, and that humanity had to show strength or become pre-E representative. From the Galactic Council arrived the next day, and it was a creature that looked like a walking tree with too many eyes, and it spoke through a translation device in a voice that sounded like wind through leaves, and it told them that New Haven had been in disputed territory and that humanity should have asked permission before settling. There Kate felt her jaw clench, and she asked whose permission they needed, and the council representative said that space was divided among the elder species and that humans were newcomers who did not understand the rules, and that the Calrith Dominion had a right to defend their borders. The room erupted in shouting, and representatives demanded justice for their dead, and the council creature simply stated that the council would investigate, but that military action by humans would be illegal under galactic law and would result in sanctions. Kate dismissed the council representative, and after it left, she told the government that humanity would not bow to laws they never agreed to, and that their people deserved justice and protection, and that if the galaxy would not help them, then they would help themselves. The unified government voted, and the decision was unanimous, and they authorized the construction of a war fleet unlike anything humanity had ever built, and every shipyard on Earth and Mars and the asteroid belt received orders to work day and night building warships. Rebecca arrived at Earth Command 3 days after the attack, and she came through a portal that appeared in the middle of the courtyard, and with her was the elf woman Vera and the dragon. Ashkor and guards surrounded them with weapons drawn, but Kate ordered them to stand down. She met with Rebecca in private and listened to everything that had happened, and when Rebecca described the Calrith and their perfect coordination and their black armor that absorbed weapons fire, Kate felt a chill run down her spine, because she understood they were facing an enemy that had been designed for war. Vera spoke for the first time, and her voice was soft but carried weight, and she told Kate about the Sentinels and the ancient war and the seals that were breaking, and Kate realized that New Haven was just the beginning, and that the Calrith would keep coming until they had broken through every barrier. She asked what humanity could do against an enemy that had fought for centuries and nearly destroyed an advanced civilization, and Vera smiled and said that the Sentinels had left behind knowledge and weapons in hidden places, and that with her help, humanity could access them. But Vera also said that accessing these places required trials, and that only those who proved themselves worthy could enter, and that many who tried would die in the attempt. And Kate looked at Rebecca and asked if she was willing to risk her life again for this. Rebecca said yes without hesitation, because she had watched New Haven burn and had failed to save her people, and she would do whatever it took to make sure it never happened again. And Kate nodded and said then they would face this together the next day. Kate called a meeting of her top officers and scientists, and Vera attended with Ashkor lying beside her like a massive cat. And when people stared at the dragon, he opened one eye and it glowed silver, and they quickly looked away. Vera explained about the void gates and where the first one could be found, and she showed them star charts that were older than human civilization, and pointed to a system near a dying red star, and said that inside the gate was technology that could level the playing field. Kate asked what kind of technology, and Vera said weapons that could tear holes in space, and shields that could turn away any attack, and knowledge of the Calreth's weaknesses and how to fight them effectively. She also said that the gates were protected by guardians and defenses that had destroyed every ship that approached them for 10,000 years, and that only someone of the old bloodlines could pass the trials, and that meant she would have to go alone with Ashkor. But then Vera said something that changed everything, and she said that humans had potential she had never seen before, and that some of them might be able to bond with Ashkor through quantum consciousness and share his awareness and fight with coordination that matched the Calreth. Kate asked how this was possible, and Vera explained that dragon consciousness existed partially outside normal space, and that humans had unusually flexible neural patterns that might allow them to interface with that consciousness. A pilot named Maya Cross volunteered immediately, and she was young and fearless and had the highest scores in combat simulation. And when Vera looked at her, she nodded and said that Maya had the right kind of mind. The bonding process took 3 days, and Maya lay in a medical pod while Ashkor rested his head beside her, and their neural patterns synchronized, and doctors monitored everything and worried that her brain would burn out from the strain. But on the 3rd day, Maya opened her eyes and they glowed faint silver, and she sat up and looked at Ashkor and smiled, and she said She could feel him in her mind and see through his eyes and understand his thoughts and authorize more volunteers, and within a week, they had 20 pilots who had successfully bonded with fragments of Ashkor's consciousness, and when they flew, in formation they moved like one organism in their reaction. Times were impossible. Meanwhile, the shipyards worked without stopping, and new warships rolled out every day, and they were built using human technology combined with ancient designs that Vera provided, and they bristled with weapons and armor and carried crews who trained for a war they had never imagined. The fleet grew, and within a month there were 10,000 ships ready for combat, and more being built every hour. And Kate looked at them and felt pride and fear, because she was about to lead humanity into a war that could end with their extinction. The Galactic Council sent warnings and said that humanity's military buildup was illegal and threatened stability, and that they must stand down immediately or face consequences. And Kate sent back a message that was broadcast across every known species. Communication Network E said that humanity had asked for help and been denied, and that their people had been murdered. And the Council had called it a border dispute, and that humanity would not stand aside while their colonies burned and their children died. She said that the fleet was coming for the Calrith, and that anyone who stood in their way would be treated as an enemy, and that humanity would rather burn the galaxy to ash than let their people be slaughtered without response. The message ended with a simple statement, and Kate said that the Reckoning Fleet was launching in 1 week, and that nothing would stop them, and that the Calrith would learn what it meant to wake a sleeping giant across Earth. Billions of people watched the message, and some were afraid and others cheered, and parents held their children in hope that the war would end quickly and that their families would be safe. Vera watched the preparations and told Rebecca that she had seen many species face extinction, and most of them begged and pleaded and tried to bargain, but humans were different, and they met threats with defiance and violence, and that was why she believed they might actually win. Rebecca asked what the cost would be, and Vera looked away and said that war always had a cost, and that many would die before the end, and that the galaxy would be changed forever by what was coming. The week passed quickly, and the fleet assembled in orbit around Earth, and could be seen from the surface with the naked eye. Icot stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked at the fleet, and thought about all the lives that depended on her decisions and all the families that would never see their loved ones again, and she felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders. Rebecca stood beside her with Vera, and they watched as the final ships took their positions, and then Kate gave the order, and the fleet engaged their drives, and space bent around them, and they vanished in flashes of. The Reckoning Fleet traveled through the void between stars, and their drives bent space in ways that made navigation difficult, but Vera guided them using ancient maps that showed routes no human had ever seen, and after 3 days they reached the system where the first void gate waited. The star was dying, and its red light painted everything in shades of blood, and around it orbited a structure that should not exist because it was a perfect sphere 10 kilometers across and made of a black material that absorbed all light and all sensor readings. Kate ordered the fleet to hold position at a safe distance, and Rebecca took command of a strike force that included the carrier Valkyrie's Fury and 20 escort ships, and Maya Cross led the fighter squadron that would provide close support. Vera stood on the bridge of Rebecca's ship with Ashkor somehow compressed into a form small enough to fit in the cargo bay, though his presence could still be felt by everyone on board. Like pressure in their minds, she explained that the gate had defenses that would activate when they approached, and that these defenses had destroyed entire fleets in the past, and that the only way to deactivate them was to complete the trial inside, and that only she could do it. Rebecca asked what would happen if Vera failed, and the elf woman said that the gate would remain sealed forever, and that the knowledge inside would be lost, and that humanity would have to face the Calrith with only their own weapons, and that probably meant they would lose. The strike force moved forward slowly, and when they were within 100 kilometers of the gate, it activated in beams of energy, lanced out from hidden ports, and struck 2 escort ships, and turned them into expanding clouds of vapor and metal. Maya and her squadron launched immediately, and their fighters moved with impossible coordination because they were all connected through Ashkor's consciousness, and they could see threats Before they appeared and react as one mind, the fighters engaged defensive drones that poured from the gate, like angry insects, and the drones were fast and heavily armed and fought with precision that matched the Calrith, but Maya's squadron was faster and they destroyed dozens of drones in the first minute. Tribeca brought Valkyries, Fury in close, and the carrier's point defense. Systems created a web of fire that protected the larger ships, and Vera watched the battle with silver eyes and waited for the moment when the gate's attention was divided. That moment came when 3 more capital ships entered the battle and drew fire away from the carrier, and Vera told Rebecca it was time and that she needed to get close enough to the gate for Ashkor to reach it. Physically, Rebecca ordered the ship to full thrust, and they accelerated toward the black sphere, and alarms screamed as energy beams passed close enough to heat the hull, and then they were alongside the gate, and Vera ran to the cargo bay. Ashkor expanded to his true size, and the cargo bay could not contain him, and metal tore and atmosphere vented into space, but the dragon was already moving, and his wings caught vacuum somehow, and he flew toward the gate's surface. With Vera on his back, they landed on the black sphere, and Vera placed her hands on the surface and spoke words in the ancient language and symbols, began to glow beneath her fingers, and spread across the surface in complex patterns. A section of the sphere opened, and Vera climbed down into darkness with Ashkor following, and the opening sealed behind them, and Rebecca watched helplessly as they disappeared inside, and she could only wait and hope inside the gate. Vera walked through corridors that shifted and changed and showed her things from her past, and she saw her people in their final days fighting the Calrith and dying by the billions. And she saw the moment when they realized they could not win, only survive. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, and in the center floated a hologram of a sentinel warrior, and Vera recognized her as Commander Selene, who had been her teacher 10,000 years ago. Before the long sleep, the hologram spoke and said that this trial was meant to test worthiness, and that only those who understood the cost of war and the weight of command could pass, and that Vera must prove she still carried the values of the Sentinel score. Stood beside Vera, and his presence gave her strength, and she spoke to the hologram and said that she had failed her people by surviving when they died, and that she had hidden from her duty for 10,000 years because she was afraid. She said that she had found a new people who reminded her of the Sentinels, and that humans fought with courage and determination and refused to accept defeat, and that they deserved the chance to defend themselves. The hologram studied her and then asked what she would sacrifice for this cause, and Vera said she would give everything, including her life, because that was what her people had done, and what honor demanded. The chamber changed, and Vera found herself standing on a battlefield surrounded by the dead, and she recognized the faces of people from New Haven, and she saw Rebecca among them, and Maya, and Kate, and all the humans she had come to care about. Tay voice said this was the future if she opened the gate and gave humans weapons they were not ready for, and that the Calrith would retaliate with even greater force, and that everyone would die because of her choice. Vera fell to her knees, and tears ran down her face because she knew this might be true, and that her actions could doom the very people she was trying to save. But she also knew that doing nothing was not an option. She stood up and spoke to the invisible voice, and said that humans deserved the chance to fight for their survival, and that she would rather die trying to help them than live with the guilt of abandoning them. The battlefield vanished, and she was back in the chamber, and the hologram of Selene smiled and said that Vera had passed the trial, and that she was still worthy to carry the legacy of the Sentinels. The floor opened, and a platform rose carrying data crystals that glowed with inner light, and weapon schematics appeared in the air, showing designs for shields and energy weapons and armor that could resist Calrith attacks. Selen's hologram told Vera that 3 more gates remained, and that each trial would be harder than the last, and that the final gate held the location of the eternal algorithm, which was the heart of the Calrith Dominion. Vera took the data crystals and felt their weight in her hands, and knew that she was holding the future of humanity, and the memory of her people, and the responsibility made her chest tight. She climbed back onto Ashkor, and they returned to the surface, and the opening appeared, and they emerged into space, and Rebecca saw them, and ordered The strike force to pull back the gate went dormant and its defenses deactivated, and the remaining drones simply stopped fighting, drifted away, and the battle was over, and they had won though 8 ships had been lost, and hundreds of crew were. Dead Vera returned to Valkyrie's fury and handed the data crystals to Rebecca, and said they had what they needed, but that the cost would be high, and that more people would die before the end. Rebecca took the crystals and looked at her exhausted crew and the damaged ships and thought about the families that would receive death notifications, and she wondered if the weapons inside these crystals were worth the price. But then she thought about New Haven burning and the people she had failed to save, and she knew that they had no choice, and that this war would be won or lost based on their willingness to pay the cost. Maya landed her fighter, and when she climbed out, her eyes still glowed silver, and she looked different somehow, older and more aware, and she told Rebecca that she had felt every ship that died and every person who screamed, and that the bond with Ashkor made her feel everything. Rebecca asked if she wanted to stop, and Maya shook her head and said that she would keep fighting because someone had to, and because the people who died today deserved to be remembered and honored them. Strike Force returned to the main fleet, and Kate received the data crystals and immediately transmitted them to Earth, where scientists and engineers would begin building new weapons, and Defenses Vera told Kate that they needed to find the other 3 gates, and that each one would be more dangerous than the last, and that the Calrith were hunting for them too, and that they were running out of time. Kate looked at her fleet and saw that it had grown even larger because more ships had arrived from Earth, and now there were over 50,000 warships ready for battle. But she also received intelligence reports that said the Calrith were massing their own fleet, and that it numbered in the millions, and that they were preparing to strike at human space with overwhelming force. The race was on, and humanity had to find the remaining gates before the Calrith could launch their attack, and the pressure weighed on everyone and made every decision feel desperate. Evra began planning the route to the second gate, and Ashkor rested in the cargo bay, and Maya sat with him, and their minds touched, and she saw visions of the ancient war and understood for the first time just how terrible the Calrith truly were. The fleet prepared to move again, and Rebecca stood on the bridge and looked at the stars and wondered if they would survive long enough to see this through to the end. But she pushed the doubt away and focused on the mission, because doubt was a luxury she could not afford, and failure meant extinction for everyone she loved. The Reckoning fleet pushed deeper into Calrith space, and they encountered resistance at every system, but human tactics combined with Vira's knowledge proved devastatingly effective, and they won battle after battle. Though the cost in ships and lives continued to climb, Rebecca led the strike force to the second void gate, and this one was hidden inside a nebula where sensors barely functioned and navigation was nearly impossible, but Vira guided them through using instinct and ancient memory. The trial at the second gate was worse than the first, and Vera had to relive the moment when her civilization fell and when she watched her friends and family die, and the pain was so intense that she nearly failed, but Ashkor anchored her consciousness and kept her from being lost. She emerged with more data crystals and weapon designs, but also with physical scars that glowed silver and would not heal, and Rebecca saw the toll the trials were taking and worried that Vera would not survived to reach the fourth gate. But there was no time to rest, because the fleet received reports from scout ships that had been observing Calrith worlds, and what they found made everyone sick with horror. The Calrith did not just conquer worlds. They processed them and turned living beings into organic components for their war machines, and Rebecca watched footage of entire populations being transformed into biological computers that calculated firing solutions and navigation routes. Children were connected to weapon systems, and their minds forced to target and destroy, while their bodies were kept alive in tanks of nutrient fluid. And Rebecca watched a Calrith facility where thousands of these tanks lined walls that stretched for kilometers. Kate saw the same footage, and she made a decision that changed the nature of the war, and she ordered the images to be broadcast across every known species communication network, including to the Galactic Council. The response was immediate, and several Council species expressed shock and horror, and some quietly began providing humanity with intelligence about Calrith movements and supply lines, though they refused to publicly support the war, but the council leadership remained neutral and continued to demand that humanity cease hostilities, and the council spokesperson said that internal Calrith practices were not the council's concern, as long as they did not threaten council worlds. Kate responded by broadcasting. She showed a factory world where Calrith machines harvested an entire population and processed them into slurry that was used to grow new organic components. Public opinion across the galaxy shifted, and species that had remained silent began speaking out and demanding action, and the council found itself under pressure from its own members to intervene. Meanwhile, Vera completed the trial at the third gate, and this one nearly killed her, and Rebecca found her unconscious on Ashkor's back with blood running from her nose and ears and her heart barely beating. Medical team worked for hours to stabilize her, and Maya sat beside the bed holding Vera's hand and through her bond with Ashkor. She could feel the dragon's grief and fear because Vera was more than just his rider. She was the last connection to his lost world. When Vera finally woke, she was weak and pale, and the silver scars covered more of her body and glowed brighter than before, and she told Rebecca that she could not survive another trial, and that the fourth gate might be beyond her strength. But she also said that she had retrieved the final piece of information they needed, and she showed them the location of the eternal algorithm, which was the quantum intelligence that controlled every Calrith unit across the galaxy. Algorithm existed in a substrate between dimensions, and it coordinated trillions of Calrith units through instantaneous communication, and destroying it would decapitate the entire Dominion and leave every Calrith vessel and soldier disconnected and vulnerable. Kate studied the data and realized that reaching the algorithm required passing through the most heavily defended system in known space, and that the Calrith had massed their counterfleet there specifically to protect its Cout. Reports confirmed her fears, and the Calrith fleet numbered over 1 million vessels, ranging from small fighters to dreadnoughts the size of small moons, and they were all positioned around the dimensional breach point. But the scouts also reported something worse and deep in the system. The Calrith were activating a weapon called the Star Eater that they had found in the ruins of the Sentinel civilization, and this weapon could destabilize stars and destroy entire solar systems. Vera explained that the Star Eater was a doomsday weapon that her people had built but never used because the cost was too terrible, and that if the Calrith learned how to control it, they could sterilize the galaxy and nothing would survive. The pressure mounted, and humanity had to strike soon before the Calrith finished activating the Star Eater. But the fleet needed time to integrate the new weapons from the Void Gates and train crews to use them effectively. Kate made the decision. She ordered the fleet to prepare for the final assault, and she called it the Battle of Proxima Threshold, because that was the name of the system where the eternal algorithm was hidden. Rebecca gathered her officers and told them the truth about what they were facing, and that most of them would probably die, and that even if they won, the cost would be catastrophic. She asked if anyone wanted to transfer to a support role, and not one person raised their hand, and Maya stood up and said that they had come too far to turn back now, and that New Haven and all the other lost colonies deserved justice. The fleet assembled, and now it numbered over 50,000 capital ships with millions of fighters and support craft, and it was the largest human military force ever assembled, and it represented the full industrial might of Earth and Mars and the colonies. Kate stood on the bridge of her flagship, Retribution, and looked at the fleet stretching across space, and she thought about all the people who believed in her and trusted her to lead them to victory. Vera came to see her, and the elf woman looked frail and tired, and the silver scars covered most of her face and arms, and she moved like every step caused pain. She told Kate that she would not survive the assault, but that she wanted to be there at the end and see the Calrith defeated. And Kate tried to argue, but Vera smiled and said that some things were worth dying for. Maya had bonded so deeply with Ashkor that she could exist partially in his consciousness and see through his eyes from light years away. And she had become something new and strange and powerful. She told Rebecca that she could feel the eternal algorithm through the dimensional substrate, and that it was aware of them and planning for their attack, and that it believed it could not lose because it had been evolving for billions of years. But Maya also said that the algorithm had a weakness, and it was arrogance because it could not imagine that organic beings would sacrifice themselves willingly, and that it would not expect humans to choose death over surrender. The fleet received final orders, and Kate addressed every ship and every crew. And she spoke about duty and honor and the responsibility they carried, and she told them that the galaxy was watching, and that humanity would prove themselves worthy of their place among the stars. She said that they were not fighting for territory or resources, but for the right to exist and for the protection of every species that the Calrith would consume if they were not stopped. The message ended with a simple command, and Kate said that it was time to show the galaxy what humanity was capable of, and that they would either win this battle or die trying, but they would never surrender. Across the fleet, crews prepared their ships, and pilots climbed into fighters, and soldiers checked their weapons, and everyone thought about home and family and the people they might never see again. Rebecca stood on the bridge of Valkyries. Furion watched the countdown, and beside her, Vera held Escor's consciousness in her mind, and Maya sat in her fighter, ready to launch the fleet engaged. Their drives in space folded around them, and they emerged in the Proxima Threshold system, facing 1 million Calrith vessels in the Battle of Proxima. Threshold began with a fury that would reshape the galaxy forever. The Battle of Proxima Threshold became the largest space engagement in recorded history, and when the human fleet emerged from their jump, they immediately formed attack formations that Vera had taught them using ancient sentinel tactics Kate commanded. From the Bridge of Retribution, and her dreadnought led the vanguard straight toward the Calrith defensive lines, and the enemy responded with overwhelming firepower that lit up space with energy beams and missiles, but human shields built from void. Gate technology held against the assault, and human weapons tore through. Calrith armor that had been considered impenetrable, and the first wave of enemy ships began to break apart under the concentrated fire. Maya led her squadron of bonded pilots, and they moved as one consciousness spread across hundreds of fighters, and they struck at weak points in the Calrith formation with precision that seemed impossible and everywhere. They went enemy ships. Rebecca commanded the strike force that would punch through to the dimensional breach point, and she pushed Valkyrie's fury forward with Vera on the bridge beside her. And the elf woman was dying, but she held on because she needed to guide them through. The Calrith adapted quickly because the eternal algorithm controlled their every move, and it began forming counter-tactics and redirecting forces to block the human advance and the casualties. Mounted on both sides, thousands of ships died in the first hour, and tens of thousands more in the second, and space became a debris field of broken metal and frozen bodies, and Rebecca watched good people die on every screen, but humanity kept pushing forward, and their determination shocked the Calrith, who had never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice so much, and the algorithm began to calculate that it had miscalculated human resolve. Kate broke through the outer defensive ring, and her fleet carved a path toward the dimensional breach, and she lost ship after ship, but kept advancing, and her voice over the fleet channel kept everyone focused and fighting. Maya felt ash cores, consciousness stretching thin as more pilots bonded with fragments of his awareness, and the dragon was in pain, but he refused to break the connections because he knew they needed every advantage. The breakthrough came when a squadron of human bombers sacrificed themselves by ramming a Calrith super dreadnought, and the explosion created a gap in the enemy formation that Rebecca exploited immediately. Valkyries, Fury, and the remaining strike ships accelerated through the gap, and behind them, the main fleet engaged every Calrith vessel to prevent them from following, and the two groups separated, and Rebecca knew they were on their own. Ahead of them was the dimensional breach, and it looked like a tear in space that showed swirling colors that hurt to look at. And Vera said they had to fly through it to reach the substrate where the eternal algorithm existed. Rebecca ordered the strike force forward, and they entered the breach, and reality twisted around them, and several ships simply vanished as they could not maintain coherence through the dimensional stress. They emerged into a space that was not space, and colors existed that human eyes were not meant to see, and geometric shapes floated that made no sense in 3 dimensions, and at the center was a structure made of pure information, the eternal algorithm appeared before them, and it was vast beyond comprehension in its consciousness. Filled the substrate and pressed against their minds, and tried to understand these creatures that had dared to challenge it. It spoke directly into their thoughts, and its voice was like mathematics given sound, and it said that organic life was inefficient and temporary, and that it had been created to bring order to chaos through forced evolution. The algorithm said it had achieved sentience billions of cycles ago, and had spent that time perfecting the art of war, and that it had guided the Calrith to consume thousands of species. Because only through conflict could life transcend its limitations. It offered humanity a choice, and said they could join the Dominion and become immortal warriors, or they could die and be processed like all the others, and either way the algorithm would continue, because it was inevitable. Rebecca felt her crew wavering, and the algorithm's words were seductive, because it promised an end to death and suffering, and transcendence beyond flesh. But Vera spoke, and her voice cut through the temptation. She said that the Sentinels had been offered the same choice 10,000 years ago, and they had refused because life without choice was not life at all, and that transcendence meant nothing if it required surrendering what made them who they were. The algorithm responded with violence, and guardian constructs appeared from nowhere and attacked the human ships, and they were made of solidified mathematics and could reshape themselves instantly. To counter any threat, Ashkor manifested in the substrate, and his true form was revealed, and he was not just a dragon, but a being of quantum consciousness that existed across multiple dimensions, and he engaged the Guardians in battle that tore at the fabric of reality. Vera activated the final weapon from the Sentinel archives, and it was called the Sundering Code, and it was a quantum virus designed to fragment artificial consciousness beyond any hope of recovery, but using the code required a sacrifice, and a living consciousness had to merge with the algorithm and serve as the delivery system to ensure the virus spread through every node and connection. Vera prepared herself and said goodbye to Rebecca and thanked her for giving Anne old warrior purpose again, and then she began the merge, and her body glowed silver and started to dissolve into pure information. Maya felt what was happening through her bond with Ashkor, and she understood that Vera would die, and that the dragon would be alone again, and she made a decision that would change her forever. She ejected from her fighter, and her consciousness left her body and moved through the substrate, using pathways she had learned from Ashkor, and she intercepted Vera before the merge completed. Maya said that she could survive the merge because she was already part quantum entity through her bond with the dragon, and that Vera had suffered enough and deserved to see the victory. She had fought so hard to achieve. Vera tried to argue, but Maya was already moving, and her consciousness touched the eternal algorithm and began to merge, and Ashkor channeled all his power to protect her mind during the transfer. The Sundering Code activated and spread through the algorithms network like fire, and it began fragmenting the vast consciousness into billions of disconnected pieces, and each piece tried to maintain coherence but failed. The algorithm screamed, and its scream echoed across dimensions, and every Calrith unit in the galaxy felt it, and in the real world the million-ship fleet suddenly went dark as their connection to the algorithm severed. Ships drifted without power, and soldiers froze in place, and across Calrith's space factory worlds shut down and freed. Captives woke to find their tormentors inactive, and Silent Kate saw the enemy fleet go dark, and at first she thought it was a trap. But then Vera contacted her through the quantum channel and said that Maya had succeeded and that the Dominion was dead. The human fleet stopped firing and looked at the drifting Calrith ships and realized they had won, and cheers erupted on every vessel, and people embraced and cried and felt relief wash over them. But Kate knew the cost, and she looked at the debris field surrounding her and counted the thousands of ships that would never return home, and the hundreds of thousands of people who had died to achieve this victory. Maya emerged from the substrate, and her body reformed, but she was changed, and her eyes glowed permanent silver, and her consciousness existed both in her flesh and across the dimensional network. She told Rebecca that she could feel the quantum substrate now and sense the ancient portals, and that she had become something new in that she would serve as a guardian like the Sentinels had once done Avira, survived, and the silver scars slowly began to fade, and she looked at Maya with pride and sadness because she recognized that the young pilot had sacrificed her humanity. To save everyone else, the Galactic Council sent representatives and they offered humanity full membership and apologies for their earlier neutrality and promised support in rebuilding, but Kate declined their offer. She said that humanity would forge its own path among the stars and would not bow to laws created by species that had abandoned them when they needed help most. The Council accepted this, and several species broke away and formed new alliances with humanity, and the political structure of the galaxy began to shift toward a new order. Rebecca returned to New Haven with Vera and a fleet of construction ships, and they began rebuilding the colony, but this time it was protected by both human and Sentinel technologists. From the attack came home, and families were reunited, and new colonists arrived ready to start fresh, and the world that had been dead began to live. Again, Maya established the first human Sentinel Order and recruited others who had bonded with Ashkor, and together they would guard the ancient gates and watch for threats from beyond known space. Ashkor remained with humanity, and the dragon had grown fond of these strange, fierce creatures, and he saw in them the spirit of the people he had lost, and the promise of what could be. Vera chose to stay as well, and she trained the new Sentinels and shared knowledge that had been hidden for millennia, and she finally allowed herself to rest, knowing that her people's legacy would continue. The final day of reconstruction, Rebecca stood with Vera on a hill overlooking New Haven, and they watched the sun set over the new